Hello, and you're welcome to the Book Club at Leitrim Daily. My name is Mary Blake, and I'm here today with Michael Geoghegan, Hilda King, and Orlagh Kelly to discuss this month's book, which is House of Glass, a memoir by Hadley Freeman. Orlagh, welcome.
Hi, Mary.
You chose this book. I know you said it came well recommended, but can you give us an overview of the book before we start chatting about it?
Can, of course. So this is the story of a Jewish family that spans the 20th century. Hadley Freeman's grandmother, Sala, her father's mother, was, to a young Hadley, remote, French, stylish, but always sad. And after Sala died and Hadley became a journalist, she decided to find out more about her grandmother. Through this, she discovered a shoebox, which was full of documents, photos, mementos, and a sketch by Picasso, no less. By piecing it all together and through extensive research, she uncovers her grandmother's lives, but also her grandmother's brothers' lives, Henri, Jacques, and Alex. From the poverty and persecution of their birthplace in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on to Paris, and for Sala, America, she tells each of the siblings' life story viewed through the prism of the changing and dangerous political environment of the 30s and 40s in France. Henri, the eldest, an engineer by trade and an inventor of the microfilm, he spent the war years in France using his fake identity papers to hide his Jewishness, but while also traveling France, microfilming and preserving French documents before they were destroyed. Jacques, obliging, compliant Jacques, whose loyalty to France and belief in humanity's better nature undoubtedly led him to his incarceration in a French concentration camp and onwards to his death in Auschwitz. Alex, arguably the most colourful, he was the fighter of the family, and in the 30s he was involved in the couture business. He was a friend of Christian Dior, who was his draftsman, and the artist Marc Chagall. As the war came upon them, he joined the French Foreign Legion because as a non-French citizen, he wasn't allowed to join the French army. He was captured and escaped. And then afterwards, he was a successful art dealer and friend of Picasso. Sala was sent to America to save her life, which it did. But she also went to an arranged marriage and to a life confined to being a housewife. She was estranged from her country that she loved, France, and her family. Her world was small and her unhappiness was great. Through each of their lives, fate, chance, bravery, and the choices they made with the information they had at the time, it's vividly told. It's a story of identity, politics, humanity, and courage. Lives lived out loud, but lives lived just to actually get to live. And really, I think that just sort of encapsulates all of what Hadley Freeman did with her family, really, to be honest. So.
Even as you're speaking about it like that, Orla, it's so, I mean, there's such sadness. I mean, it's just, you talk about humanity, we also have to acknowledge the inhumanity that was happening there. And we like to think it's so far in our past that it could never happen again. But look, who knows? Michal, I'd be interested to hear what you thought of the book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was excellent. Thought it was brilliantly researched and really well written. I've read quite a few World War II and Holocaust books. But I thought the approach here was really interesting, that she sort of viewed the horrors of World War II and the interwar period through the 4 different lives of her grandmother and her great uncles. And I think the approach to identity in particular was particularly engaging in that context. You know, she covers how each of them engage with their Jewish identity very differently in France in that period. And it's interesting that it was Jacques, the one who probably clung to his Jewish identity the most in Paris in the interwar years, that ultimately was the one who ended up dying at Auschwitz, while the others sort of distanced themselves from their Jewish identity to different degrees. and managed to survive. It certainly raises questions about the extent to which I think cultural identities, the extent to which Jewish cultural identity and indeed marginalized cultural identities in general need to be hidden away, in effect, to live in the modern, or what was the modern Western world.
Yes, and the assimilation of the Jewish people, the importance of that for preservation, I suppose in normal times would have held more weight than in Jacques' time. And unfortunately for him, he's just such a tragic person in this. Interesting, as you said, the way that this story was unpacked. You know, we're straight in there with the suitcase of memorabilia, and bit by bit we meet these old people at the end of their lives, and bit by bit we visit the people that they were. Yeah, I thought it was such a well put together book and so well researched. And I'm not a fan of I rarely pick up memoirs and read books like this, but I'm glad I did in this case. Hilda, can I ask you what your thoughts are on the book?
Yeah, I'm sort of afraid to say I agree a lot with what Micheál has just said. I thought it was a very readable book, very informative. I think she gave she integrated a nice backdrop of history and a position with each of the stories of the lives of the three granduncles and the grandmother. And again, very well researched and laid out in such a way that you could follow it. Even though she sort of went forward and backwards, it still clung together very well. For me, the interesting thing was that that this was a story based in France, because a lot of the historic Holocaust stories are German or Polish or whatever, and the whole idea of assimilation was sort of something I hadn't really ever read about, and you know that if they mixed with the culture, they were damned, and if they didn't mix with the culture, they were also damned. I thought she portrayed that very, very well through the four characters. In fact, they were sort of extreme characters in many ways. You had Jack, who was passive and was trusting in the fact that he'd been living there for roughly 20 years, and the French wouldn't see him as different. And then you had Alex, who was very similar, but much more of an aggressive male, and didn't take any chances, and knew was very determined that he was going to survive and live, and if he could at all, bring his family through. Now, as the book went on, I sort of thought maybe I was getting too much detail, particularly when I went into all the fashion stuff. I sort of felt, well, do I need to know all this sort of thing? But then I looked back at the beginning again, and she said that she wondered herself, had she been too self-indulgent in doing a whole book on her own family history, and that she started writing it in 2016. Now, she'd been researching it for about 10 years, but she started writing in 2016. And because of Brexit, which was very strong at the time, and the debate around it, and Donald Trump being in power, she thought, no, it's an apt time, because we're talking about keeping people out and outsiders. And I think there was a survey around 2018 that said something like 1 in 3 Europeans knew little or nothing about the Holocaust. So for me, that sort of made the whole reading of the book worthwhile, because it had that broader platform of how we're all, we're dealing with immigrants here all the time. The Irish were immigrants in America. There's a whole, it's not, we can't remain isolated in our little world anymore and think it won't affect us. And when the economy moves up or down, this is when people begin to think they are taking our jobs, inverted commas, or whatever, and causes a whole lot of repercussions. Anyway, that was roughly.
Immigrants are expected to naturally detect this need that we have for them to behave in a certain way. Interesting. Any of us who lived in Africa before, we were always called expats, but you know, people, we call them immigrants the other way around. You know, it's different, even the use of our language, and people who are not born in our country coming to live here. Orlagh, you recommended this book. Are you glad
Yes,
you
I did.
did?
Yeah, I think that's a very strong point what Hilda was saying about you know, the sense of refugees and some of the, and actually Hadley Freeman does say that I think it's last year there was a bill brought in to prevent unskilled refugees or migrants coming into Britain. And she said that that's what my family were when they moved to France and when her mother was in America. And also it's noteworthy that her grandfather, Bill Friedman, he actually was also a Jew, and also he had to change his name, and he was persecuted in their small community when she moved to America too. So the universality of it is very, it's very relevant now as it was then. And I think she told that really strongly. I liked the structure of the book. I liked meeting each of the brothers, and it is very interesting meeting them when they're old and then they become older, and then this full formed life just right behind. It's like you're opening out, it's like an accordion of their lives, and it's so fascinating, and the revelations of things that they needed to do in order to survive, just to get by. And I think that, you know, again, that is the assimilation and how their mother was undefiantly, you know, Jewish all the time and was able to manage to survive in France, even though they hid her. Those amazing survival stories, and, you know, everything was so, being Jewish was very important to the mother, whether the rest of them and the next generation are not practicing that. To be Jewish is to put a light over your head. And I thought that was really interesting. And she also says about it that it is the story, her family exemplifies the story of what is the Jewish story, what happened at that time, which is assimilation, which is what Henri did to a degree, prospering, which is what Jacques did, emigration, which is what Sala had to do, and then of course death, which was visited on Jacques. So I just think that, and she was just saying that that's my family, but that's the Jewish story, and it's very sad, but I think she told it really well, personally.
I think she did, and I think as well, although it is a family story, it is you know, I'd say a lot of people had that experience, and a lot of their families, and so wonderful that they can be remembered, and they have her telling their story at this time as well. I think it's amazing. I wonder, was she particularly kind in how she spoke about Sala, as opposed to Sonia, for example? So we have characters here, and I suppose the confusing thing at the beginning of starting out this book is the different names. So they all had their given name, their Jewish name, and when they moved to France, they took a more, I suppose, European name that would sound less Jewish. And so that took a little bit of getting used to. Who is she talking about again? She does have a little graph at the beginning of the book to show us who she's talking about, that I had to reference a few times coming over and back. She seemed to have a very sympathetic view, particularly of her her paternal grandmother, as you can imagine she would, and seemed to really feel that Sala was a very big victim in this, more so than the rest of them. Did any of the rest you pick up on that, or was I particularly looking out for it?
I was just conscious of it, because I thought what was very interesting about it was she mentions it in terms of Sala's gender. Sala was not expected to be anything other than what she was, and I think that that all of the way, like, and I love the fact that she said that it was her fashion, her sense of how she dressed was the most important thing to her, because that was her identity, because she wasn't permitted to be anything other than what was set out for her. She was engaged to somebody else when she was forced to leave, and that circumstance, yeah, but she did that for her family, which didn't materialize. And I think that the idea that this woman really gave her life for the next generations. I think that's a very true story. I think that happens now. I think it's been happening for generations. So if that's considered kind, I would say she was then, yeah.
Yeah. I suppose Sala was the baby in the family. They had lost children, another girl at birth or as a very young baby. And I think the brothers, this was their way of saying, let's look after Sala. And this is the way you look after somebody in the situation like this. You get them the hell out of Dodge, you know? And so I think a part of her didn't kind of said, I never asked for this. I didn't want this. I want to be this French woman in Paris. I don't want to be this Jewish woman in America. Hilda.
Yeah, totally. I don't know. I felt a sense of anger rising in me with Alex because he lied to her completely. He told her she was going to go over to a millionaire. He was in the fashion business, that she was saving them by going. So I really never forgave him for that. And she was miserable all her life because the only place she wanted to be was Paris. She had left her true love. And, you know, he saved his mother, who was twice her age and never spoke French, always spoke Yiddish. He was able to bring her to Cannes, you know, and he didn't deal with it in his memoir either, which meant he did actually feel guilty about it, which, you know, I'm glad. But yeah, no, and I just felt she never had a choice. It was never a choice of hers to go. He imposed it on her and wouldn't support her when she offered to come back even. And it was all for her good. I don't really believe, I don't know what was behind it. I know she was delicate and all the rest, but I felt he had such contact with all the powers that be and everything else, and he did it for his mother. And Sonia was brilliant as well. So I had an issue there. Go ahead, Michal.
Yeah, I suppose it's historically the fate of a lot of women in some sense, sort of essentially married off by men when men had that level of control and that degree of control as well. So I think that sort of, it probably rings true to the story of a lot of women at that time who weren't really allowed to make their own decisions and to forge their own path, even in such dire circumstances as she was undoubtedly facing. I think, yeah, I would say that it really rings true that even in that circumstance, the lads all had the opportunity to remain free insofar as they made their own decision, but it seemed like Sala's decision was made for her.
Totally.
I wonder, could she have? I mean, to say that Alex lied about the wealth of this guy she was being married off to. Surely, was that her motivating factor for going over? Did she like the idea of being a rich wife, or
no? She had no choice. She had absolutely no choice. You know, that was bottom line. No.
Yeah, but
she was saving her family. She was told that she would save her family, and I think that was one of the biggest things, and that was the reason. And she was bullied into doing it, by both Jacques, backed up by Henri, as well as Sonia, at that point. And no, I think it was just purely for that, and the reality of what she faced was very obvious when she arrived there. And it wasn't that Bill was a bad man, but the deal was done between men. And it was to save her family, and then it turns out he doesn't have enough money to save her family. If that was ever the deal, that's the interesting thing that we don't know. That's the thing, you know. So
interesting. You mentioned Sonia there, another really great, strong female character in this in this family life, and I really liked Sonia. Actually, I thought she was fantastic and smart, and she was a real survivor as well. You know, she made up the false identity cards, and she gave her costume jewelry to a guard to avoid being taken prisoner and everything. So I really thought Sonia was a fantastic character, and that seemed to be a very much Sonia and Henry had a really love marriage. I think they really did seem to be a genuine, where Bill, Sala never was interested in loving Bill. It seemed that she just didn't love him. So I thought Sonia and Henry, and they looked after everybody. They looked after Mila after Jacques was killed, and they looked after the mom, this crazy mom that sounds so stubborn, and how she survived the whole thing is so impressive. You know, going around grumbling, speaking Yiddish and Polish, and that was it. And you know, so yeah, I thought that was interesting. The way they never identified as Polish, and I don't know. So they identified as Jewish first, and then French. So I thought it was interesting that, you know, even Sala, the youngest, was 15 when she left Poland, and they really never wanted to acknowledge that birthright, that, you know, that they were Polish, and always sold themselves as French people. Michal.
Yeah, well, I suppose, why would they? In a way, because they were born into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so Poland didn't really exist per se. At the point where Polish national identity started to solidify, they were essentially the victims of Polish nationalism. So the pogroms seem to have started after the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the idea that they would have identified as Polish, I think,
they never would have. Yeah.
If they had to identify, I'd imagine, with their homeland, it would have been more in the context of Austria-Hungary. I imagine, anyway.
Yeah, and even the pogroms, I believe there was even a pogrom in Limerick in 1904, can you believe? Did you know, any of you know about that? I just came across that. A priest, Father John Craig, between 1904 and 1906, got rid of some Jewish people in Ireland, because I suppose we like to think that we could never have this capacity for hatred in us, that, you know, that we could do this. But this happened. Even there was a pogrom in Limerick that I thought just was interesting. Yes. Orlagh, come back to you. Anything else that you think we should discuss on this?
Well, sorry, the other thing just to say about that is interesting about that in Limerick, but it also just shows that the persecution of the Jews is not, it didn't just start, which I think a lot of people just think, oh, it's just the Holocaust. I mean, this has been going on for, you know, a lot longer than that. So I thought that, and I think that she captures that quite well, in that sense that this is something that's, and the ease with which people can be anti-Semitic and they're not aware of it, or, you know, pretending to be not aware of it. I think she captured that very well, and she captures that very well throughout the book in the telling of their stories. I mean, I suppose we would be a bit remiss if we don't talk about Alex. I mean, Alex was certainly I mean, he was quite a, you know, he's quite a larger than life character. And also she got so much of her information, which enabled her then to do all of her research, or helped her in her research, was through his unpublished memoir. I like the fact that when she got the first copy of it, there was sections, there was about 12 pages missing, and then it was found with another 12 pages in. So it's very interesting, but it formed the basis for a lot of the stories, and to be able to talk about, you know, the story, the part where Jacques comes home from the French concentration camp to see his daughter born, and then returns. And that's a verified story. I mean, it's interesting because I like that with him. I suppose I'm jumping a bit now, but just to talk about Alex, is that he came across as a character. She presents him as somebody, as sort of a bombastic guy that he tells stories, and in family lore nobody sort of believed him, because this is what Alex does. And when she sort of investigated it through the stories that he was telling in his memoir, it sort of bore out. The majority of the stories were true, and that's from the extensive research and of the type of person that he was. So I think, and the life that he lived was very determined to live, to have a life, to have a chance of a life. Even, you know, and I think that poverty of the youth, and that incident of the pogroms before they moved out of that area, really, I think it seems that that's the thing that he said that drove him. And for him to go from that to becoming a friend of Picasso, to running art galleries, to jumping out of, I have to say, I was thinking that if this was a novel and he tells me that it was jumping out of a train, a skylight, and landing, I would say that's just unbelievable. but clearly
amazing.
not. So he had a fabulous life and a real sort of will to live. Again, like Hilda, I felt strong anger and held it against him, and still do, about Sala, because Sonia was so strong, Henri's wife, even though they didn't like each other. And so was Henri. They were able to get fake papers, and I understand that you can only do so much, but I couldn't understand why they couldn't extend that to Sala. But that's just the deals that had to be done, maybe.
Yeah. And interesting that Alex always hated Sonia and Mila, actually, these two sisters-in-laws, really hated them. And the writer said that Danielle, which is Henry and Sonia's daughter, really, when she meets her now, she says, oh, that Alec, he was an obnoxious man. Whereas because the writer's mother had a good relationship with Alec, she didn't have that passed down to her to the same extent, So I think he was terribly unreasonable to his sisters-in-law, and really not a whole lot of justification for it, I didn't think.
I think he thought they were ugly.
Yeah, he was.
And they weren't worthy of his brothers.
Yeah, dumpy Polacks or something, he called them. It was quite incredible. But even in the pictures, which is so nice to see actual pictures in a book, it's always so lovely. And I'm looking at these women and I think they look exactly like Sala, and just as beautiful as Sala, and I don't see why they're considered so offensive. And Alec was a very driven man, and sounds like he was very well liked by the upper echelons of society. He was able to position himself very well with important people. Hilda.
Yeah, he was. I mean, from the outset, he was very clever about his whole strategy, and he was refused to join the French Legion because it was full of Franco's people and all sorts of mismatches, and they didn't want him, and he got in anyway, and he wanted to get in so that he would have this to stand to him. I fought on French soil, and by God, it did stand to him, because he inveigled himself, or Perret, the general in charge of clearing the Jews and against the resistance. He was able to call on him so many times. It was unbelievable how he got away with it, because Perret was put forward as, he was the guard for Pétain, and he was in charge of clearing all the Jews, and he was in charge of checking out all the French resistance. And here was Alex, who was both a Jew and in the French resistance, and he was able to get Perret to sort him out several times, and it was all because Perret identified with him as a French soldier, and Perret didn't want France infiltrated by Germans and the wrong sort of people. So somebody like Alex, who was being nationalistic for him, was in his favor. So he was an amazing character, really, Alex. He had great gumption. And wasn't there a time in Cannes? I mean, he nearly invented his life again in Cannes, as it was in Paris. He started up his couture, and he was making, and we don't know, did he make uniforms for the Germans, but there was all this possibility. And for him, getting on was who you knew, he said. Who you knew was much more important than what you knew. And
he was a survivor.
Imagine having the audacity to, at the nightclub, to sort of tell the band to stop playing this German thing, and the guy says, there's Gestapo's here, and he says, I don't care, I don't want this, and your man comes up to him with a gun and he tells him to go F off,
Amazing.
And he shouts, yes, I am a Jew, I mean, he had amazing, if we can believe it all, and she seems to have backed it up. So it really is film worthy, all of that. You can see it all being, so dramatic. That character Alex is so, well, the person Alex, because he's not a character, is so dramatic.
And it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget that Alec is a real person sometimes, because his life is just, as you say, Hilda, it's just like a movie unfolding in front of you. I thought it was interesting as well. The writer mentions in passing fetishizing grief and pain. and how film, and for people like me who haven't studied history, and as a young person, to my shame, slept during history class until I could get out of it. My knowledge of the Holocaust and my knowledge of most historical events are through movies, TV shows, documentaries. And she did mention fetishizing grief, and I thought it was an interesting take, because without those kind of entertainment ways of educating people like me, I really would know even less. Does anybody have anything to come in on that? Or my own there. Yeah, I just thought I'd mention it because there was another thing that she mentioned as well about that transgenerational trauma that is passed on, or the epigenetics, I think. It's something that there has been studies done on, even with our own history with the Great Hunger, and how it affects us going forward, even can change your DNA, the trauma that your grandparents would have suffered. And she said that she knows this to be true from knowing her relations rather than the scientific side of it. So they were just two things that jumped out at me when I read them. Have we covered everything? Michal, have you anything else to add, or any of you jump in?
I think it's just interesting. Sorry, mate. Just on the second point that you made there about transgenerational grief and pain. When you look or you consider that from the point of view of the Jewish people, I suppose it's brought home much more, because I suppose the Jewish people have been sort of the eternal outsiders wherever they've been in Europe for more than a millennium, really. You can go back to Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, and you find the character of Shylock. Who is a stereotype of the sort of, money-grubbing Jewish character, and he is reviled by everyone in the story, and he is given that great monologue where he points to his humanity, but in the overall context of the story, he is still reviled. He's still the villain of the story.
Yes.
You can go back to medieval England. The Jewish people were essentially persecuted by King Edward I, and their properties were taken to finance his wars. So I suppose throughout history, that has to have been the case for almost every generation of Jewish people. And I think
that's true. Yes, and even Shylock's punishment was that he would have to leave his faith, wasn't it, or become Christian or something? It was his punishment, so yeah, interesting. It was a very good book, in my opinion. I really did enjoy it. I found it hard work at times. I did find myself going back on chapters a few times and saying, let me figure out who we're talking about again here. But that could be more me than the book, to be fair. But I thought it was extremely readable and not preachy at all. I didn't find it preachy or judgy in any way. I thought she told a very fair story, seen as it was a family story and very personal to her. Yeah, so you all pretty much enjoyed the book? Well, enjoy is a hard word.
Yeah, it is. I think the feeling I got towards, overall was sort of that for Jews, they'll always be looking over their shoulder. They'll never feel safe. It's worldwide. It's not just this time, that time. There's always that feeling. And then she reflected that in saying about the family all only had one child because they didn't want, she felt they didn't want to bring children into the world because they couldn't protect them. And the fact that all her family had assimilated and they're not practicing Orthodox Jews is a telling story in itself. Yeah.
And as well, how the different personality types of these siblings affected their outcomes. I thought that was very interesting as well. The tough little fighters, the kid who was stealing meatballs as a kid was the guy who grabbed his opportunities and made his opportunities. And the one who just took what was going, unfortunately, didn't survive the that time in France. I think France came out quite poorly in it, and Poland. You know, you did. I suppose, as I think Hilda said earlier, really we always associate this story with a German setting, and it was interesting to see how the French people kind of denounced their own as well. So yeah. Look, it's grim reading too when you think of it, but it told well as a family saga. So I would certainly recommend it to people who haven't read it. If we haven't spoiled it, if you've listened to this much, we probably spoiled it. But I certainly will be recommending it. Anything else that you've had time to read or recommend, guys? Or have you been busy with this book?
Busy with that book, yeah.
Yeah, same. It nearly took my whole month.
Yeah.
Same as that, yeah.
Yeah, great. So that brings us on to our next month's book choice. Orlagh.
Yes, it's me again, and I sort of agonized over this because particularly you know, when you're going from a memoir, as I mean, enjoyable is not the, well, it is enjoyable. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Those people are very alive to me now, and so I appreciated and enjoyed it a lot. But I'm going to a tougher one. But Mary, this is something that I think you're going to be pleased about. The book that I've chosen is Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart.
Yes.
And this was the winner last year of 2020's Booker Prize. And it's a debut novel. Another debut, Hilda. We seem to do a lot of that unintentionally. I sort of did think that maybe I should pick something else, but it's hard when you want to. But anyway, I'll give you a quick overview of the story. Glasgow is dying, and good families must grift to survive. Agnes Bain has always expected more from life. She dreams of greater things, a house with its own front door and a life bought and paid for outright, like her perfect but false teeth. But Agnes is abandoned by her philandering husband, and soon she and her three children find themselves trapped in a decimated mining town. As she descends deeper into drink, the children must try their best to save her, yet one by one they must abandon her to save themselves. It is her son Shuggie who holds out hope the longest. Shuggie is different, fastidious and fussy. He shares his mother's sense of snobbish propriety. The miners' children pick on him and adults condemn him as no right, excuse my Scottish accent. But Shuggie believes that if he tries his hardest, he can be normal like the other boys and help his mother escape the hopeless place. So that's Shuggie Bain. Doesn't sound all fun, but it's got great reviews. It's been on my list for a while. So yeah, that's Shuggie Bain.
Shuggie Bain. And Orlagh is still delivering books and sending out books. If anybody wants to ring her, find her on Facebook or phone her. She'll sort you out with that book or any book you're interested in on our recommendations. So yeah, Shuggie Bain it is. So we're off to Glasgow for the next one.
Yes.
This is as close as we get to going away, guys. We were in Paris and now we're going to Glasgow. So that'll be good. So looking forward to that. So thank you all very much for listening in to Leitrim Daily, the book club, and talk to you next month.